Detroit, 1994. A woman vanished from a quiet, working-class street. Her voice silenced, her presence erased. The system, quick to accept a simple story, filed her away as a runaway. For 20 years, a husband played the part of the abandoned, grieving spouse, a pillar of his community. But one sister refused to let the ghost rest, her relentless love a single flickering candle in 2 decades of darkness, never knowing her fight would uncover a horrifying secret hidden in plain sight, just 1 floor above a city that had chosen to forget. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. The humid August air of 1994 hung heavy and still in the small Detroit bungalow, thick with the scent of wilting hydrangeas and the unspoken terror that had become Lorraine Gaines's constant companion. At 27, Lorraine possessed a voice that could fill the rafters of the Greater Grace Baptist Church, a soaring, powerful soprano that spoke of faith and resilience. It was a voice that seemed to belong to a woman of unbreakable spirit, a perception that was both her shield and her most profound deception. Publicly, she was Sister Lorraine, the heart of the choir, the doting aunt to her sister Marcia's 2 young girls, a woman whose smile was a beacon in their tight-knit community. Privately, in the suffocating silence of the home she shared with her husband, Harold, she was a caged bird, plotting her flight in frantic, stolen moments. Her life had become a meticulous, high-stakes performance, a careful dance around the fragile ego and chilling temper of the man she had once loved. The plan was her secret gospel, a prayer she whispered to herself in the dark. It lived in a shoebox tucked deep in her closet, beneath a pile of old church programs. Inside were $1,247, saved in small, crumpled bills skimmed from grocery money over 3 years. There was a bus schedule with a route to Chicago circled in red pen, and a slip of paper with the phone number of a cousin she hadn't spoken to in a decade, a woman who had once offered a lifeline she hadn't been ready to take. Every dollar, every detail, was a brick in the foundation of her new life, a life where she could breathe without listening for the sound of Harold's car in the driveway, where her heart wouldn't seize at the heavy fall of his footsteps in the hall. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened whenever he was near. Harold's control was not always overt. It was a slow, creeping poison. It was in the way he questioned who she'd spoken to after church, the way he'd time her trips to the grocery store, the quiet, unnerving disapproval in his eyes if she laughed too loudly on the phone with Marcia. It was a tyranny of small aggressions that had systematically dismantled her confidence, isolating her piece by piece until he was the center of her universe, a dark star around which she was forced to orbit. The police had been to their home 3 times in the last year, each visit a humiliating, fruitless exercise. The first time, after he'd thrown a plate against the wall, shattering it inches from her head, the officers had been sympathetic but non-committal. Harold, ever the master of composure, had been apologetic, blaming a stressful day at the Ford plant. The second time, when he'd locked her out of the house for an entire night after she'd arrived 10 minutes late from choir practice, the police had suggested she stay with her sister for a while to let things cool down. The third time, just last week, after he'd grabbed her arm so hard the bruises bloomed like dark violets on her skin, their response had shifted. They saw a hysterical, emotional woman and a calm, weary husband. "Ma'am, you two need to sort this out," the older officer had said, a note of paternalistic fatigue in his voice. "We can't be coming out here every time you have a spat." Each call, meant to be a cry for help, had instead become a mark against her own name in their official ledger, painting her as the unstable one, the provocateur. She knew then, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the system would not save her. She had to save herself. Tonight was supposed to be the night. Harold was on the late shift at the plant, not due home until after 2 a.m. Marcia was expecting her to sleep over, the coded plan they had devised. Her bag was packed, hidden under the bed, containing only a few changes of clothes, her Bible, and the shoebox. She rehearsed the steps in her mind, a frantic litany of logistics. She would walk the 12 blocks to the Greyhound station, buy her ticket with cash, and be on the 3:15 and bus to Chicago. A ghost slipping out of the city under the cover of darkness. She stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she washed the last of the dinner plates. The familiar domestic act a stark contrast to the seismic shift she was about to make in her life. She was looking at the clock on the wall, the slow, rhythmic sweep of the second hand marking the final minutes of her old life, when she heard the sound she dreaded most in the world, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. It was only 10:30 p.m. He was home early. The cold knot in her stomach became a block of ice. She turned from the sink, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Harold walked through the back door. He wasn't in his work clothes. He was wearing his church slacks and a pressed shirt. He looked at her, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes, those dark, flat eyes, held a terrifying stillness. "They sent us home early," he said, his voice deceptively calm, lines down. He walked past her, placing his keys on the counter with a soft, deliberate click. "What you all dressed up for, Lorraine? You going somewhere?" She forced a smile, her face feeling stiff and unnatural. "No, honey. Just couldn't sleep. Thought I'd finish up in here." He didn't respond. He just stood there, watching her, a predator sensing a change in the air. He began to walk through the small house, a slow, methodical tour. He went into the living room, then down the hall. She could hear him opening doors, the soft creak of the hinges a countdown to her doom. Then, the sound she had been dreading, the creak of their bedroom door. Silence. A long, drawn-out silence that stretched for an eternity. She stood frozen in the kitchen, unable to move, unable to breathe. He reappeared in the kitchen doorway. In his hand was the shoebox. Her plan, her hope, her entire future, held in the hand of her jailer. He opened the box and slowly, deliberately, tipped it upside down. The money, the bus schedule, the cousin's phone number, it all fluttered to the linoleum floor like dead leaves. He looked from the scattered contents of her life to her face, and for the first time that night, he smiled. It was a cold, thin, triumphant smile, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. "Going somewhere, Lorraine?" he repeated, his voice no longer calm, but a low, menacing whisper that promised a world of pain. In that moment, the caged bird knew. The door to her cage hadn't just been locked. It had vanished entirely. The escape she had so carefully planned had just become the beginning of a nightmare beyond her darkest imagining. The discovery of the shoebox had transformed Harold. The quiet, simmering menace that had defined their marriage erupted into a cold, terrifying clarity of purpose. There was no shouting, no explosive rage. There was only a chilling, methodical efficiency that was far more frightening. He overpowered her with an ease that was humiliating, his factory worker strength no match for her desperate, flailing attempts to resist. He pushed her into the bedroom, the scattered remnants of her escape plan crunching under his shoes, and locked the door from the outside. She heard the scrape of a chair being wedged under the knob, a crude but effective barricade. For hours, she sat on the floor in the darkness, listening to the sounds of his movements downstairs. She heard him on the phone, his voice a smooth, placid river of deception. Then, a new sound. The wail of a distant siren, growing closer. Panic seized her. She banged on the door, her voice raw with desperation. "He's lying, don't listen to him, help me!" But her cries were swallowed by the thick wood of the door, by the solid construction of the house he had turned into her prison. When the police car pulled up, its flashing red and blue lights painting grotesque, dancing shapes on her bedroom ceiling, Harold was waiting on the porch, a portrait of serene, heartbroken composure. He met the two officers with a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumped in a performance of profound defeat. "She's gone," he said, his voice laced with a carefully measured sadness, just like she always threatened she would. Packed a bag and left. Said she was going off with some man she'd been seeing. The two officers, the same ones who had responded to the call last week, exchanged a look of weary resignation. They recognized Harold. They remembered his emotional wife. This narrative, this simple, clean explanation, fit perfectly with the box they had already built for her. "You see where she went?" "Which way?" the younger officer asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Harold shook his head. running a hand over his face in a gesture of exhausted despair. It all happened so fast. We had another argument. She said she was done, that she'd met someone else. She had a bag packed. Been planning it for a while, I guess. She just walked out. Didn't even say goodbye to me proper. He let his voice crack just enough to sell the lie. Inside, Lorraine screamed until her throat was raw, her fists beating against the door, the sound a dull, pathetic thud against the overwhelming force of his lie. The officers downstairs heard nothing but the chirping of crickets and Harold's soft, mournful voice. They didn't ask to come inside. They didn't ask to check her room to see if her things were really gone. Harold's story was plausible. It was easy. And most importantly, it closed a file that had become a minor, recurring annoyance. He had called them. He was the calm one. She was the one with the history of spats. The pieces clicked into place with a fatal, bureaucratic neatness. After the police left, their tires crunching on the gravel as they drove away from the scene of a crime they had just unknowingly sanctioned, Harold came back into the house. He calmly went to his workshop in the garage. Lorraine listened, her ear pressed to the floor, as the rhythmic, metallic sound of a hammer hitting nails echoed up through the structure of the house. One by one, he was sealing her in. The sound was the final, terrifying punctuation mark on her old life. He was not just locking a door, he was erasing her from the world. When he was finished, he came upstairs, unlocked the bedroom door, and stepped inside. He looked at her, huddled in the corner, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He held a plate with a sandwich and a glass of water. "You must be hungry," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He placed the plate on the floor, just inside the door, as if feeding a dog. "This is how it's going to be now, Lorraine. You wanted to leave me. Well, you're never going to leave me again." He backed out of the room, and she heard the sickening, final sound of a heavy deadbolt, newly installed, sliding into place. The click echoed in the silence, a sound that sealed her fate more completely than any legal document or prison sentence ever could. The final lie had been told, and the world had believed it. She was no longer a person. She was a ghost, a story, a closed case. Marcia Holloway felt the news in her bones before she heard it with her ears. An unsettling dread had coiled in her stomach all morning, a sister's intuition that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. When she called Lorraine's house and Harold answered, his voice thick with a strange, syrupy grief, the dread crystallized into pure, cold horror. "She's gone, Marcia," he'd said, the words a rehearsed, hollow performance. "She finally did it. She left me." Marcia dropped the phone, the clatter of the plastic against the floor a small, sharp sound in a world that had suddenly gone silent. She was at his house in under 10 minutes, her car screeching to a halt at the curb. She stormed up the porch steps, bypassing the doorbell and bursting through the unlocked front door. Harold was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, the very picture of a man adrift in sorrow. The sight of his calm, composed face filled her with a rage so potent it was dizzying. "Where is she, Harold?" Marcia demanded, her voice shaking with a fury that was part passion, part terror. "What did you do to her?" Harold looked up, his expression one of weary, practiced patience. "Marcia, please. I'm as heartbroken as you are." She packed a bag. "The police have already been here. She just left." "Liar." The word exploded from her, a raw, ragged sound. "Lorraine would never leave without talking to me. She would never leave her nieces. She would never, ever, just walk away from her life, from her church, from everything she loves. You're lying." She began to move through the house like a storm, flinging open closet doors, looking under beds, her frantic movements a stark contrast to Harold's unnerving stillness. She was calling her sister's name, her voice echoing in the small, silent rooms. The house felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. It felt like a stage, a carefully constructed set for the tragedy he was performing. She ran for the stairs, a primal instinct pulling her towards the second floor, towards Lorraine's room. Harold moved then, faster than she'd ever seen him move, blocking her path. "There's no point," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "She's not here. You're upsetting yourself for nothing." His body was a wall, a physical manifestation of his lie, and the look in his eyes was no longer one of grief, but of cold, hard warning. It was a look that stopped her in her tracks. It was a look that confirmed her deepest fears. The police station was a sterile, impersonal place that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Marcia, her face pale and tear-streaked, tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate torrent. "You don't understand," she pleaded with the officer at the front desk, a man who looked at her with an expression of bored sympathy. "He's lying. My sister is in danger. He's hurt her, I know he has." She was eventually granted a few minutes with a Detective Miller, a tired, heavy-set man with a crumpled suit and a deeply cynical view of the world. He listened to her with a kind of detached, professional patience, his pen making lazy circles on a notepad. She told him about Harold's temper, about the bruises Lorraine had tried to hide, about their coded plan for her escape. She told him that Lorraine, a woman of deep faith and unshakable family loyalty, would sooner cut off her own arm than abandon her family without a word. Detective Miller listened, and then he sighed. A long, weary exhalation that was the sound of 1,000 similar stories, of 1,000 domestic dramas he had seen play out. "Ma'am," he began, his voice gentle but firm, the kind one uses with a hysterical child. "I understand you're upset, but we've been to that house before. We've spoken to your sister. We know the situation was volatile. Her husband was calm. He was cooperative. He says she packed a bag and left of her own free will. Frankly, given the history of disturbance calls, that seems like the most likely scenario. But it's not," Marcia insisted, her voice cracking. "He's performing. Can't you see that? You have to go back. You have to search the house." Miller steepled his fingers, his expression hardening slightly. "Miss Holloway, we don't have a search warrant because we don't have any evidence of a crime. We have a domestic dispute and a woman who, by all accounts, decided she'd had enough. Your sister is an adult. She has the right to leave if she wants to. My hands are tied." Her emotional pleas, born of a deep primal knowledge of her sister's character, were being interpreted as nothing more than the grief-stricken denial of a woman who couldn't accept the truth. The system had already chosen its narrative. Harold was the plausible, heartbroken husband. Lorraine was the emotional, unstable wife who had finally bolted. Marcia was just the grieving sister who couldn't let go. She walked out of the police station and into the harsh afternoon sun, a profound sense of helplessness washing over her. She had the truth, a truth that burned in her heart with the certainty of a religious conviction, but no one was willing to listen. The world had accepted Harold's lie, and in doing so, it had just helped him bury her sister alive. The fight, she realized with a chilling certainty, was hers and hers alone. Detective Frank Miller considered himself a pragmatist. After 20 years in the Detroit Police Department, most of it dealing with the messy, tragic, and often predictable fallout of human relationships, he had learned to trust patterns over passions. Emotion, in his experience, was the enemy of reason. It clouded judgment, twisted facts, and led investigators down rabbit holes. And Marcia Holloway, with her tear-streaked face and her frantic, desperate accusations, had been a storm of pure, unadulterated emotion. He sat at his cluttered metal desk, the Lorraine Gaines file open in front of him. On paper, the case was a textbook example of what the department unofficially called domestic burnout. He scanned the reports from the 3 previous disturbance calls. The language was consistent. Female subject was highly emotional. Male subject stated they were arguing over domestic matters. Parties separated for the night. To Miller, these reports were not evidence of a woman in terror. They were the predictable beats of a toxic relationship spiraling towards its inevitable conclusion. He saw a couple who fought, a wife who threatened to leave, and a husband who finally had to report that she had followed through on her threats. It was a sad story, a common story, a story that ended not with a crime, but with a slammed door and a new life started somewhere else. Then there was Harold Gaines himself. Miller prided himself on his ability to read people, and Harold had been an open book. The man had radiated a quiet, dignified sorrow. He hadn't been angry or defensive. He had been weary, defeated, the very model of a man who had tried to hold his marriage together and failed. His story was linear, logical, and consistent. There were no holes, no hesitations. He had answered every question with a kind of sad, straightforward honesty that Miller found entirely convincing. He was, in the detective's professional opinion, a credible witness to the end of his own marriage. He picked up the phone and called Harold, a final box to check before closing the file. "Mr. Gaines, Detective Miller here again. Just a follow-up. Has your wife tried to make any contact? Any calls? Anything?" "No, Detective." Harold's voice was soft, mournful. "Not a word. I suppose she's started her new life. I just pray she's safe, wherever she is." The performance was flawless. The concern, the hint of forgiveness, it was the perfect final touch. "I understand, sir. Thank you for your time." Miller hung up the phone and made a final notation in the file. Interviewed husband. No new leads. Subject's sister remains convinced of foul play, but presents no evidence. All available information points to a voluntary disappearance, recommending case be classified as inactive. He closed the folder, the cardboard cover making a soft, final thud. In his mind, he was acting with cold, dispassionate logic. He was a gatekeeper of the department's limited resources, and those resources couldn't be wasted chasing the emotional phantoms of a grieving sister. A crime required evidence, a body, a weapon, a witness, a ransom note. The Lorraine Gaines case had none of these things. It had only a history of arguments and a plausible explanation. It was a social issue, not a police matter. What he couldn't see, what his pragmatic, pattern-seeking mind was utterly blind to, was the monstrous reality hiding behind the mask of plausibility. He couldn't comprehend that Harold's calm was not the product of innocence, but of a profound and chilling psychopathy. He couldn't imagine that the emotional cries for help he had dismissed were the desperate final warnings of a woman on the brink of being swallowed whole. His fatal error was not one of malice, but of a profound, systemic cynicism. He had seen so many relationships crumble that he had lost the ability to recognize when one had been shattered by a truly malevolent force. He saw a familiar pattern and applied a familiar label, never once considering that he was looking at a beast that wore the perfect camouflage of a sad, simple story. He placed the file in the outbox, to be carried away by a clerk and buried in the vast, dusty archives of the city's forgotten sorrows. With that simple, bureaucratic act, Detective Miller had done more than just close a case. He had bolted the door from the outside. He had reinforced the lie, silenced the only voice crying out for the truth, and condemned Lorraine Gaines to a silence and a darkness that the system he represented would now refuse to even acknowledge existed. The investigation was over before it had ever truly begun. The world, once a vibrant, sprawling map of possibilities, had shrunk to the dimensions of a 14 by 14-foot box. The first few days of Lorraine's imprisonment were a blur of disbelief and terror. She paced the confines of her new reality. A caged animal, her mind refusing to accept the finality of her situation. She tested the door, her hands raw from pulling at the unmoving deadbolt. She ran her fingers over the windows, feeling the rough, splintered wood of the frames where Harold had hammered them shut from the outside. The nails driven deep, a series of crude, brutal stitches sealing her off from the world. Her only connection to the life that had been stolen from her was the sounds that filtered through the walls. The distant wail of a city siren, the rumble of a passing truck, the faint melodic chime of the ice cream man in the late afternoon. These mundane noises were both a comfort and a form of exquisite torture, reminders of a world that was moving on, completely oblivious to her existence. Her only human contact was with Harold. Twice a day he would unbolt the door, his presence filling the small room with a suffocating tension. He would place a tray of food on the floor, a sandwich, a bowl of soup, a glass of water, and then he would leave, locking the door behind him. He rarely spoke. His silence was a weapon, a constant, looming reminder of his absolute power. He was her jailer, her provider, her god. This silent, controlling presence was a more profound form of abuse than any of his previous outbursts. He was systematically erasing her, stripping her of her identity, reducing her to a creature who was dependent on him for her most basic survival. She screamed until her throat was a raw, bloody mess. She begged. She pleaded. She reasoned. She appealed to the man she had once loved, the man she had married in the Greater Grace Baptist Church. hoping to find a flicker of the person he had once been. But the man who stood on the other side of the door was a stranger, a hollowed-out shell animated by a cold, possessive rage. Her pleas were met with the same unnerving silence, the same dead-eyed stare. He had what he wanted. He had her, and he would never let her go. Hope, she discovered, was a dangerous, painful thing. In the first few weeks, she would listen for the sound of Marcia's car, for the sound of her sister's furious, loving voice at the front door. She fantasized about the police returning, about them finally seeing through Harold's lie and breaking down the door. But the days bled into weeks, and the silence from the outside world was absolute. The hope began to curdle, turning into a bitter, agonizing despair. She was alone. She had been forgotten. The world had moved on, and she was trapped in this timeless, airless limbo. To survive, she realized she had to kill that hope herself, before it killed her. She had to accept her new reality, not as a temporary state, but as her life. The four walls of the upstairs bedroom were her entire world now. The sliver of sky she could see through a crack in the boarded-up window was her sun and her moon. The silence was her companion. She was a prisoner, and her sentence was for life. The transformation was slow, and it was brutal. She began to mark the passage of time by the changing quality of the light that filtered through the boards, by the subtle shifts in the sounds from the neighborhood. She learned the rhythm of Harold's movements downstairs, the creak of the floorboards that signaled he was in the kitchen, the muffled murmur of the television in the evenings. Her world had become a place of small, sensory details, a universe contained within the peeling wallpaper and the dusty floorboards of her prison. This was her new reality, a life lived in the shadows, a silent, unseen existence in the heart of her own home. She was a ghost in her own life, a secret buried just one floor above a world that had pronounced her gone. Harold Gaines perfected his role with the meticulous dedication of a seasoned actor. His performance as the abandoned, heartbroken husband was a masterpiece of subtlety and restraint. He didn't overplay the grief. He allowed it to settle into a quiet, dignified melancholy, a cloak of sorrow that he wore with a kind of noble resignation. In the weeks and months after Lorraine's disappearance, the community wrapped him in a cocoon of sympathy. Casseroles and plates of fried chicken appeared on his doorstep. The women from the church would pat his hand, their eyes full of pity, telling him he was in their prayers. The men from the plant would clap him on the shoulder, offering gruff, awkward words of support. Harold accepted it all with a humble, grateful grace, his quiet dignity only serving to solidify his image as the victim. His most brilliant performance was at the Greater Grace Baptist Church. Every Sunday, he would sit in the same pew he had once shared with Lorraine, his head bowed, a solitary, tragic figure. When the choir sang, their voices swelling in the hymns Lorraine had once led, he would discreetly wipe a tear from his eye. The congregation saw a man clinging to his faith in the face of a devastating betrayal. They saw a saint. They had no idea that the woman whose absence they mourned was lying in a bed just a few miles away, a prisoner listening to the silence of her own stolen life. He maintained the house with a quiet, almost obsessive fastidiousness, as if he were the faithful curator of a shrine to his lost love. He kept Lorraine's garden, tending to the hydrangeas and the rose bushes she had so lovingly planted. He hosted the annual neighborhood barbecue on the 4th of July, flipping burgers on the grill, a sad, lonely man doing his best to maintain a sense of normalcy. He was a good neighbor, a reliable taxpayer, a quiet, church-going man who had been dealt a terrible hand. The lie became his truth. He lived it, breathed it, and wrapped himself in it so completely that the monster beneath was rendered invisible. His double life was a study in compartmentalization. Downstairs was the world of Harold Gaines, the sympathetic widower. He would watch television, read the newspaper, and pay his bills, a life of mundane, unremarkable routine. Upstairs was the secret, the part of his life that he attended to with the same detached efficiency as taking out the trash or mowing the lawn. He would prepare Lorraine's meager meals, carry the tray up the stairs, and slide it into the room, his face a mask of blank indifference. He was not just her jailer. He was the sole architect of her reality. The man who controlled the light, the food, the very air she breathed. His control was absolute, And in that control, he found a profound, twisted satisfaction that he had never known when she was free. The years passed, and the story of Lorraine Gaines, the woman who ran off, became a settled, accepted piece of neighborhood lore. The initial whispers and suspicions faded, replaced by the solid, undeniable reality of Harold's quiet, lonely existence. He had become a fixture, a landmark of quiet tragedy. The community's pity was the perfect camouflage, a shield that deflected any potential scrutiny. He had created a narrative so powerful, so plausible, that it had overwritten the truth entirely. He was the neighborhood saint, the man who had endured, and just one floor above the heads of the sympathetic neighbors who waved to him on the street. His greatest sin, his living, breathing secret, remained locked away in the suffocating silence of the upstairs room. Marcia Holloway's life became a lonely, two-front war. By day, she was Mrs. Holloway, a dedicated and beloved third-grade teacher at a local Detroit elementary school, a single mother raising two bright, happy girls. In this world, she was a pillar of strength and stability, a woman who commanded respect. But by night, and in every stolen moment in between, she was a warrior, a detective, a ghost hunter, engaged in a solitary battle against a wall of disbelief and indifference. Her sister's disappearance had carved a hole in her life, a void that she refused to allow the world to paper over with Harold's convenient lie. The first few years were a storm of frantic activity. She spent thousands of dollars of her teacher's salary, money she could barely afford, on printing flyers. The smiling, vibrant face of her sister looked out from telephone poles, from community center bulletin boards, from the windows of laundromats and corner stores all over the city. Missing, the bold letters screamed, "Lorraine Gaines, have you seen her?" But the flyers would get rained on, their ink bleeding like tears, or they would be covered over with advertisements for local politicians and church bake sales. They were a fragile, fleeting protest against a city that had already forgotten. Her relationship with the Detroit Police Department devolved into a frustrating, circular dance of futility. Every few months, she would call or visit the precinct, asking for an update on the case. The response was always the same. A new detective would pull the file, scan the single page of notes left by Detective Miller, and deliver the same, tired verdict. "Ma'am, the case is closed. It was deemed a voluntary disappearance. There's nothing more we can do." She became an annoyance, a familiar, sad figure that the desk sergeants would see coming and greet with a weary sigh. They saw her not as a determined advocate for justice, but as a woman unable to cope with her grief, a crazy sister who couldn't accept that her sibling had simply chosen to leave. The community that had once been a source of strength became a landscape of awkward silences and averted gazes. People pitied her, but they didn't believe her. Harold's performance had been too convincing. To her neighbors, Marcia's refusal to accept the truth was a sign of her own instability, a painful, public display of a grief that had festered for too long. They would cross the street to avoid having to talk to her, to avoid the discomfort of her unwavering, inconvenient conviction. Her own daughters grew up in the shadow of their missing aunt. They knew the story, and they saw the toll it took on their mother. The late nights she spent poring over maps and phone books, the haunted, faraway look that would sometimes come over her in the middle of dinner. They were her rock, her reason for getting up in the morning, but they were also a constant, painful reminder of the family that Harold had shattered. She built her own cold case unit in a corner of her small basement. She had a map of the city on the wall, with a single angry red pin marking Harold's house. She had a corkboard covered with photos of Lorraine, timelines of the last days before her disappearance, and her own, meticulous notes from conversations she'd had with neighbors, friends, and church members in those first few weeks, searching for any detail, any anomaly that the police had missed. It was a lonely, thankless obsession, a war she was waging against the entire world's consensus. Friends told her to move on, to let go for her own sake, for the sake of her daughters. But she couldn't. Letting go felt like a betrayal. It felt like agreeing with the lie. It felt like burying her sister a second time. And so, as the years stretched into a decade, and then longer, Marcia's lonely war continued. She was a single, defiant voice crying out in a wilderness of silence, fueled by nothing more than a sister's love and the absolute, unshakable, and profoundly lonely conviction that she was right. The most exquisite form of torture was the sound of a life she could no longer live. From her upstairs prison, Lorraine Gaines became an unwilling audience to the vibrant, mundane, and beautiful symphony of her own neighborhood. The sounds, filtered through the thick walls and the boarded-up windows, were her only calendar, her only connection to a world that believed she was gone. In the mornings, she could hear the familiar, cheerful roar of the school bus as it stopped at the corner, the high-pitched chatter and laughter of children on their way to school. She would close her eyes and picture their faces, their brightly colored backpacks, their youthful, untroubled energy. It was a sound of hope and normalcy that was so close, yet so impossibly far away. On Sunday mornings, the torture was at its most profound. The faint, distant sound of the church bells from Greater Grace Baptist would drift through the air, a call to worship that she could no longer answer. Sometimes, if the wind was just right, she could even hear the faint, muffled strains of the choir. She would imagine them in their robes, their voices swelling in the familiar hymns, and a pain so sharp, so deep, would pierce her heart that it would take her breath away. She had been the heart of that choir. Her voice, her faith, had been the core of her identity. And now, she could only listen to its ghost. The afternoons brought the sounds of the neighborhood at play, the rhythmic thump of a basketball being dribbled on the pavement, the squeals of delight from children running through a sprinkler on a hot summer day, the cheerful, melodic jingle of the ice cream truck making its daily rounds. She knew her nieces, Marcia's girls, were out there. They lived only a few blocks away. She would press her ear to the wall, straining to hear their specific voices in the cacophony of childhood joy. Was that little Maya's laugh? Was that Brianna calling out to a friend? The thought that her own family, the people she loved more than life itself, were so close, living their lives in the sunshine while she was trapped in this perpetual twilight, was an agony that scraped at the very edges of her sanity. Evenings were filled with the sounds of families settling in for the night, the murmur of televisions, the sizzle of a backyard barbecue, the low, intimate sounds of conversation and laughter drifting from open windows. She could hear the life of her community, the simple, beautiful, and now entirely inaccessible rhythm of a world she had once belonged to. This proximity was Harold's greatest, unspoken cruelty. He could have taken her somewhere remote, to a cabin in the woods, a deserted farmhouse, but he hadn't. He had kept her here, in the heart of her own life, forcing her to be a constant, silent witness to everything she had lost. It was a daily reminder of her erasure. The world hadn't ended. It had simply gone on without her. The people she loved were still there, just on the other side of a wall, their laughter a testament to a life she was no longer a part of. The agony of proximity was a slow, grinding torture that was designed to break her spirit, to remind her with every passing sound that she was not just a prisoner, but a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was so close she could almost touch it, yet as unreachable as a distant star. In 2004, a full decade after Lorraine Gaines had vanished from the world, her name flickered briefly, like a dying ember, in the cold, bureaucratic heart of the system that had failed her. Detective Frank Miller, now a grizzled veteran with a paunch, a cynical squint, and a calendar on his wall marking the days to his retirement, was tasked with a final, thankless project, a review of his old, inactive cold cases. The initiative was a public relations move by a new police commissioner, a way to show the community that no victim was ever truly forgotten, even if, in practice, most of them were. Miller's office was a small, windowless room in the archives, a purgatory of forgotten files and the faint, musty smell of decaying paper. He worked his way through the stacks of manila folders, each one representing a life interrupted, a story left unfinished. Most were drug deals gone bad, gang-related homicides, cases where the leads had run dry decades ago. He handled them with a kind of detached, professional weariness, his mind already on the fishing boat he planned to buy with his pension. Then, his hand fell on the Gaines file. He blew a layer of dust off the cover and opened it. The single, sparsely worded page stared back at him. A testament to a conclusion reached too quickly. A story accepted too easily. He saw his own neat, decisive handwriting. Voluntary disappearance. He remembered the case, not in sharp detail, but as a vague impression. He remembered the calm, grieving husband. And he remembered the sister, the emotional, frantic one who wouldn't let it go. What was her name? Marcia. He remembered her fire, her absolute, unwavering conviction. For a fleeting moment, a sliver of doubt, thin as a razor's edge, pierced his carefully constructed cynicism. Had he been too quick to dismiss her? Had he mistaken a woman's desperate, intuitive knowledge for simple grief? He thought about all the cases he had seen since, the liars who seemed honest, the monsters who wore masks of civility. The world was a far more deceptive place than he had wanted to believe as a younger, more confident detective. He stared at the name, Lorraine Gaines, and for a split second, she was not just a name in a file, but a person, a woman with a family, a church, a life. A woman who had called his department for help, and who had, in the end, received none. The moment passed. The doubt was an uncomfortable, inconvenient thing, and Miller had spent a career learning to push such feelings aside. Reopening the case now, a decade later, based on a phantom feeling, a faint echo of a sister's grief, it was impossible. It would mean questioning his own judgment, admitting a potential error that had long since been buried and forgotten. It would mean paperwork, resources, and the dredging up of a sad, messy domestic situation that had, for all intents and purposes, resolved itself. He took his red pen and stamped the file with the final damning word, Archive, Permanent. He initialed it, his signature a small, neat, and final act of institutional forgetting. He placed the folder in a cardboard box destined for a deep storage facility, a vast, climate-controlled tomb where the city's inconvenient stories went to die. He had been given one last chance to hear the ghost in the file, one final opportunity to question the lie he had so readily accepted. But the system, and his own weary, cynical heart, had no room for ghosts. He closed the box, taped it shut, and moved on to the next file, leaving Lorraine Gaines buried for a second time, deeper and more completely than ever before, under the crushing, silent weight of the official record. Sanity, Lorraine discovered, was a thing that had to be actively, physically maintained. In the crushing, timeless void of her upstairs prison, her mind had begun to fray at the edges. The days blurred into an indistinguishable morass of silence and twilight, and she feared she was losing her grip, that she would dissolve into the featureless landscape of her captivity. She needed an anchor, a ritual, a tangible record of her stolen life. She found it in the mattress. It was old and lumpy, the fabric worn thin in places. One afternoon, driven by a desperate primal need to do something, she began to pick at a loose thread on the corner seam. Her fingernails, grown long and brittle, worked at the stitch, worrying it, pulling it, until a single, long, surprisingly strong piece of cotton thread came free. It was perhaps 2 feet long. She held it in her hands, this simple, humble object, and saw it not as a thread, but as a tool, a weapon against the creeping madness. She sat on the floor, and with a focused, deliberate intensity, she tied a small, tight knot in the center of the thread. This knot, she decided, was for the first month, the month she had vanished. She remembered the heat of that August, the smell of her own fear. The knot was a memorial. It was proof. She hid the thread under a loose floorboard near the wall, her first secret in her new secret world. From that day on, her life had a new, central purpose. At the end of each month, a milestone she would estimate by the slow, subtle shifts in the weather and the quality of the light, she would pull a new thread from the mattress and tie a new knot. The act was a sacred, silent ceremony of remembrance and defiance. Each knot represented a month of her life that Harold had stolen. Each knot was a testament to her survival. The collection of knotted threads grew. She kept them hidden, a secret rosary of her suffering. In the darkness, she would run her fingers over them, counting them, reliving the passage of the seasons, the slow, agonizing march of the years. This was her calendar. This was her clock. This was her diary. There was the knot for the first Christmas she had spent in that room. The sound of carolers faintly audible from the street, a form of exquisite torture. There was the knot for her 28th birthday, and her 29th, and her 30th, each one a silent, solitary marker of a life unlived. There was a knot for the summer she had heard her nieces playing in a nearby yard. Their laughter a sound that had both broken her heart and given her the strength to tie the next knot. The chain of knots grew longer, a sprawling, tangible representation of a decade of stolen time. It became a complex, sprawling thing, a testament to the sheer, mind-numbing scale of her imprisonment. It was a silent, powerful scream against the injustice of her fate. Tying the knots was more than just a way to mark time. It was an act of rebellion. It was a way of insisting on her own existence, of refusing to become the ghost that Harold and the world had tried to make her. Each knot was a declaration. I am still here. I am still alive. I remember. In the deep, suffocating silence of the upstairs room, surrounded by the ghosts of her former life, the calendar of knots was Lorraine's anchor. It was a fragile, humble, and incredibly powerful symbol of her will to endure, a secret history of her long, silent war, and a promise she made to herself over and over again. In the darkness, she would survive to see the day when she would no longer need to tie them. Evelyn Henderson had lived in the house next door to the Gaineses for 40 years. She had seen the neighborhood change, had seen families come and go, had seen children grow up and have children of their own. She was a woman who noticed things, a quiet, constant observer of the small, daily dramas of her street. And for 20 years, something about the house next door had troubled her, a low-grade, persistent hum of wrongness that she could never quite put her finger on. In the beginning, she, like everyone else, had accepted Harold's story. It was a tragedy. Poor Harold. Poor Lorraine, wherever she was. Evelyn had even brought him a pecan pie in those first few weeks, a gesture of neighborly sympathy. He had been so grateful, so quiet and sad. But as the years went on, the small, unsettling details began to accumulate, like dust in the corners of her mind. It was Harold's routine. It was too rigid, too perfect. He left for work at the exact same time every morning and returned at the exact same time every evening. His lawn was always perfectly manicured, his hedges trimmed with an almost neurotic precision. There was a sterile, unlived-in quality to the house, a place where nothing was ever out of place. It felt less like a home and more like a carefully maintained museum of a life that had once been. Then there were the windows. The upstairs bedroom window, the one that faced her own house, was the one that bothered her the most. It was supposed to be an empty, unused room, but it was never open, not even on the hottest, most stifling days of summer, and the blinds were always drawn, always. Sometimes, late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would sit in her armchair by her own window, the one that looked out onto Harold's house. And on a few occasions, over the vast expanse of 20 years, she had seen it. A flicker of light from behind the blinds, so quick she would question if she'd seen it at all. A shadow, a fleeting, indistinct shape that would move past the window and then vanish. She would tell herself it was just her old eyes playing tricks on her. A reflection from a passing car, a tree branch swaying in the wind. She was an old woman after all. Her mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be, and the alternative, the thought that something was actually happening in that room, was too monstrous to contemplate. It was easier to doubt her own senses than to believe that the quiet, polite, church-going man next door was capable of a darkness so profound. So she kept her fears to herself. Voicing them would make her sound like a crazy, senile old woman. Who would believe her? I think Harold Gaines, the poor man whose wife left him 20 years ago, has someone in his upstairs room because I saw a flicker of light. They would laugh at her. They would pity her. And so, the fear remained a secret, a quiet, nagging suspicion that she pushed down year after year. She would wave to Harold as he got his mail, and he would wave back with his sad, polite smile, and she would feel a chill run down her spine. She was the watchful neighbor, the one person whose physical proximity gave her a unique, if distorted, view of the truth. But she was trapped by the same forces that had silenced Marcia, the power of a plausible lie, the fear of not being believed, and the sheer, unthinkable horror of the alternative. She was a witness who didn't trust her own testimony, and her silence was just one more layer of insulation protecting the monstrous secret in the house next door. By the autumn of 2014, 20 years after he had sealed his wife away from the world, Harold Gaines had achieved a state of profound, unshakable confidence. His crime was no longer a secret to be anxiously guarded, but a mundane, settled fact of his daily life. A piece of domestic architecture as ordinary as the roof over his head or the floorboards beneath his feet. The passage of time had been his greatest ally, a slow, steady river that had washed away the last remnants of community suspicion and solidified his lie into unassailable truth. He moved through his life with the calm, unhurried assurance of a man who believed he was untouchable. His performance as the abandoned husband had become second nature. It was no longer a performance at all, but simply who he was in the world. The initial fear of discovery, the adrenaline-fueled anxiety of those first few years, had long since faded, replaced by a deep, abiding arrogance. He had outsmarted everyone. He had outsmarted the police, with their lazy assumptions and their bureaucratic blindness. He had outsmarted his nosy, pitying neighbors. He had outsmarted the entire world. His control over Lorraine was absolute, a fact that gave him a deep, foundational sense of order and satisfaction. She was his project, his possession, the living embodiment of his power. Her continued existence in the upstairs room was a daily affirmation of his own superiority. In his twisted, solipsistic view of the world, he was not a monster. He was a man who had been wronged, a husband who had been forced to take extreme measures to preserve the sanctity of his marriage. Lorraine had tried to leave him, to abandon her sacred vows. He had simply prevented her from committing that sin. In his mind, her imprisonment was not a punishment, but a form of protection, a way of keeping their union intact, pure, and eternal. He was her guardian, her savior, the man who had kept her from destroying herself and their life together. This profound self-deception was the key to his sanity, the narrative that allowed him to look at himself in the mirror each morning without flinching. His routine was the bedrock of his confidence, the twice-daily delivery of food, the weekly removal of the waste bucket, the monthly check of the deadbolt and the nails in the window frames. These were the rituals that maintained his universe. There was no emotion in these acts, no flicker of pity or remorse. It was simply maintenance, the care and upkeep of a thing he owned. He had grown so comfortable in his tyranny, so certain of the permanence of his secret world, that he had become careless. The meticulous caution of the early years had given way to a lazy, complacent sense of security. He had won. The game was over. His lie was no longer a fragile construct, but a fortress, impenetrable and eternal. The woman in the upstairs room was no longer a person to him, but a symbol of his victory, a settled, domestic fact. He was Harold Gaines, the quiet man from the house on the corner, a man who had suffered a great tragedy and had borne it with a quiet, admirable dignity. And this arrogance, this absolute, unshakable belief in the perfection of his crime, was the one fatal flaw in his fortress, a crack in the foundation that was about to be shattered by a single, impossible glimpse of a ghost in a window. The spark that would ignite the fire was a gut feeling, a primal, inexplicable pull. It was a cool evening in late October of 2014. Marcia Holloway was driving home from a parent-teacher conference, her mind a tired soup of student assessments and curriculum plans. Her route took her down the familiar streets of her own neighborhood, and as she approached the corner where Harold's house stood, a strange, powerful impulse made her slow the car. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a magnetic pull, a whisper from the part of her soul that had never, for 1 second in 20 years, stopped searching for her sister. She pulled her car over to the opposite curb, cut the engine, and just sat there, watching the house. It was twilight, that magical, melancholic time of day when the world is painted in shades of gray and purple. When shapes become indistinct and the imagination can play tricks. The house was, as always, quiet and still. A single, warm, yellow light glowed from the downstairs living room window, where Harold was likely watching television, living his quiet, blameless life. The rest of the house was dark, including the upstairs window, the one that had haunted her dreams for 2 decades. She didn't know why she was sitting there, what she was expecting to see. It was a vigil she had kept 1,000 times before, a silent, hopeless act of remembrance. She was about to start the car, to dismiss the impulse as another wave of grief, when it happened. For a single, heart-stopping, impossible second. She saw it. In the dark glass of the upstairs window, a shape materialized. It was a silhouette, pale and indistinct, the unmistakable outline of a person's face. It was there for a moment, a ghostly apparition against the blackness, and then it was gone, pulled back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. Marcia's breath caught in her throat. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, tired rhythm, suddenly exploded into a frantic, hammering gallop. She blinked, her mind struggling to process what her eyes had just seen. Was it a reflection? A trick of the dying light? The face of a mannequin he had inexplicably placed in the window? But her gut, her soul, the part of her that was connected to her sister by an unbreakable mystical bond, screamed a different truth. It was her. It was Lorraine. The image, as fleeting and unbelievable as it was enough. It was the crack in the wall of despair she had been beating against for 20 years. It was the confirmation of a truth she had held on to with nothing but blind faith. All the years of being dismissed, of being called crazy, of being pitied, they all melted away in that single, electrifying moment. She was not crazy. She had not been imagining it. Her sister was in that house. A new, frantic urgency seized her. This was no longer a cold case, a long-ago tragedy. This was happening now. Her sister was alive, and she was in danger, and she had just for one miraculous second managed to show herself. Marcia fumbled for her car keys, her hands shaking so violently she could barely fit the key into the ignition. She had to get to the police. She had to make them listen. This time was different. She no longer had just a feeling. She had a glimpse. She had seen a ghost. And she would not rest until she had torn down the walls of that house and brought her sister back into the light. Armed with the fragile, unbelievable power of her sighting, Marcia drove directly to the police precinct, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The hope that had surged through her was so potent it made her feel dizzy, but it was immediately met with the cold, hard wall of the same bureaucratic indifference she had been fighting for 2 decades. The desk sergeant, a young man who wasn't even alive when Lorraine disappeared, looked at her with an expression of polite, professional skepticism. "Ma'am, you think you saw a face in a window? From across the street? At twilight?" The condescension in his voice was a familiar, painful sting. He pulled the old, digitized file, his eyes scanning the brief report. "It says here the case was closed. Voluntary disappearance. There's really nothing we can do based on a silhouette." She was dismissed again, her desperate plea reduced to the ramblings of a hysterical woman. But this time, Marcia would not be deterred. The glimpse of her sister's face had forged a new, unshakable resolve in her. If the system would not help her, she would go around it. She would go to the man who had created the system's failure in the place. She spent the next day tracking down Frank Miller. He was long retired, living in a small house in the suburbs. When she arrived at his front door, unannounced, he opened it to reveal a man made soft and stooped by age, his face a roadmap of regret and weariness. He recognized her immediately, and a look of deep, uncomfortable guilt flickered in his eyes. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough, Detective," Marcia replied, her own voice steady, devoid of the frantic emotion he remembered. This time, she would not be dismissed as hysterical. She had come prepared. She carried a heavy, overstuffed briefcase. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past him into his small, tidy living room. "For 20 years, you've been able to forget about my sister," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the force of 2 decades of suppressed rage and grief. "I haven't had that luxury." She opened the briefcase on his coffee table, and its contents spilled out a testament to her lonely, obsessive war. There were the stacks of flyers, faded and worn. There were notebooks filled with her meticulous, handwritten notes. There were timelines, maps, copies of the ignored missing persons reports she had filed year after year. It was the physical manifestation of a sister's unwavering love, a life's work dedicated to a single, forgotten name. Miller stared at the sprawling analog archive of her grief, and for the first time, he saw not a crazy woman, but a relentless, methodical investigator. "I saw her," Marcia said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Last night, in the upstairs window of that house, I saw her face. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze so intense, so full of a righteous, unshakable certainty that he could not look away. You made a mistake 20 years ago, detective. You chose the easy story. You listened to the liar and you dismissed the truth. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to look at this. She swept her hand over the contents of her briefcase and to finally, for the love of God, do your job. Help me get my sister out of that house. Her confrontation was not an angry tirade. It was a quiet, powerful, and deeply moral appeal to the conscience of a man who had, for 20 years, been haunted by the ghost of a case he had closed too quickly. Frank Miller looked at the determined, weary face of the woman in front of him, and then at the mountain of evidence of her long, lonely fight. The sliver of doubt that had pricked him a decade ago now returned as a flood of profound, sickening shame. He had been wrong. He had been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. The sister's conviction, the one he had so easily dismissed as grief, had been the truth all along. And he, with a single signature, had been an accomplice to a monstrous 20-year crime. His conscience, long dormant, finally, and powerfully, awoke. The transformation in Frank Miller was profound. The weary, retired cop was replaced by the ghost of the determined, methodical detective he had once been, now animated by a powerful, soul-shaking cocktail of guilt and a newfound sense of righteous purpose. He spent the rest of the day on the phone, calling in favors from old colleagues who had risen through the ranks. His voice a low, urgent growl that commanded a respect born of 30 years on the force. He was no longer a civilian. He was a legend, and he was cashing in every chip he had. He bypassed the precinct-level bureaucracy and went straight to a deputy chief he had mentored decades ago. He didn't present Marcia's story as a possibility. He presented it as a fact, a catastrophic failure of the department that they had a moral and legal obligation to rectify immediately. Armed with Miller's professional weight and Marcia's unwavering testimony, they had enough to force the issue. They couldn't get a search warrant based on a silhouette, but they could, and did, get a judge to authorize a welfare check, a formal visit to the property to verify the well-being of its occupant. The climax arrived on a crisp, clear morning. 2 uniformed patrol cars, along with an unmarked sedan carrying Miller and a visibly trembling Marcia, pulled up in front of the small, tidy bungalow. The flashing lights seemed a sacrilege on the quiet, unassuming street. Neighbors began to peek out from behind their curtains, their faces etched with confusion. Harold Gaines answered the door, his face a perfect mask of polite, neighborly concern. "Officers, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. The lead officer, a young, stern-faced sergeant, stepped forward. "Mr. Gaines, we're here to conduct a welfare check. We've received a report that has given us cause for concern." Harold's calm faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to Marcia, who stood behind the officers, her face a pale, determined mask. He recovered quickly. "A welfare check? For me? I'm fine, officer. Thank you for asking. We need to see the entire house, sir," the sergeant said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Harold's facade began to crumble. "You can't just come into my home. You don't have a warrant. We will get one if we have to, sir. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Harold, seeing his fortress beginning to crack, allowed them entry to the downstairs. The officers moved through the sterile, obsessively neat rooms, but when they reached the staircase, Harold blocked their path, his body rigid. "This is my home. You have no right to go up there." His panic, his raw, animal terror, was the final confirmation they needed. It was the confession his mouth would never make. Miller stepped forward. "It's over, Harold." While one team of officers kept Harold downstairs, another was dispatched to get the warrant. The wait was an exercise in unbearable tension. Finally, the warrant came through. The sergeant looked at Harold. "Last chance, sir. Open the door." Harold just shook his head, his face a mask of defeated rage. The order was given. A burly officer slammed a battering ram against the upstairs bedroom door. The sound echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. The first hit splintered the frame. The second shattered the lock. The third, and the door flew open, crashing against the inside wall. The officers entered the room, their flashlights cutting through the dim, musty darkness. And there, in the corner, huddled on a filthy mattress, was a figure. Pale, emaciated, her hair long and matted, her eyes wide with a terror that was so profound it was almost primal. She looked less like a person and more like a ghost, a creature that had not seen the sun or felt a kind human touch in 2 decades. It was Lorraine. She was frail, she was broken, but she was unmistakably, miraculously, alive. The door had come down. The lie was shattered. And the ghost of Lorraine Gaines had just been found, a living soul rescued from the tomb that had been built for her in the heart of her own home. The quiet, tree-lined street erupted into a scene of shocking, surreal drama. Harold Gaines, the polite, grieving widower, the neighborhood saint, was led from his home in handcuffs, his face a contorted mask of disbelief and impotent rage. Neighbors spilled out of their houses, their morning coffee forgotten, their faces a mixture of horror, confusion, and a dawning, sickening guilt. They stared at Harold, the man they had pitied for 2 decades, and then at the pale, ghost-like figure of the woman being gently guided out of the house by paramedics, her eyes blinking against a sunlight she hadn't felt in a generation. The story they had all so comfortably believed had been a monstrous lie, and they had been its unwitting, passive accomplices. The final scene, the one that truly mattered, took place not in the glare of the news cameras that were now swarming the neighborhood, but in the quiet, sterile, and sacred space of a hospital room. Lorraine was weak, malnourished, and deeply traumatized, but she was safe. She was alive. Marcia sat by her sister's bedside, holding her thin, fragile hand, a hand she hadn't touched in 20 years. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic outpourings. The 20 years of silence and separation had created a chasm that words could not yet bridge. Their reunion was a thing of quiet, profound, and overwhelming emotion. It was in the way Marcia gently stroked her sister's matted hair. It was in the way Lorraine's eyes, which had held nothing but terror for so long, slowly began to fill with a dawning sense of safety and recognition as she looked at her sister's familiar, loving face. It was a reunion of souls, a quiet confirmation that the bond between them had never been broken, that it had stretched, impossibly, across 2 decades of darkness and silence. Marcia's unwavering faith, her refusal to accept the world's easy lie, had been vindicated in the most profound way imaginable. She had not just solved a crime, she had performed a resurrection. She had brought her sister back from the dead. The story of Lorraine's survival and Marcia's relentless fight became a citywide sensation, a horrifying and inspiring tale that exposed the deep, systemic cracks through which a woman's life had been allowed to fall. It was a story of monstrous domestic tyranny, but it was also a story of a system's casual, biased neglect, a system that was too quick to label a woman emotional and too willing to believe the calm, plausible lie of a man. But most of all, it was a testament to the enduring, unconquerable power of a sister's love. In the end, it was not the police, not the evidence, and not the system that had saved Lorraine Gaines. It was one woman, armed with nothing but her own conviction and a love that refused to let her sister's ghost be forgotten. Marcia's long, lonely war was finally over. Her sister was home. Thank you for watching.